Hello and welcome once again to Android Design in Action. I'm your host, Roman Eric.
Hey guys, my name's Adam Kosh, and today we have a special guest visiting us from London.
Hey, I'm Nick Butcher. It's good to be here in person shooting a show rather than just a little head across the Atlantic.
So today's episode is about the onboarding experience. Basically, everything from the point in which the user, downloads, maybe finds your app in the Play Store, installs it, and then starts, using it. So basically, kind of that initial, those crucial few moments between the point in which, they install and they start running. We're going to talk about ways to make that optimal, basically as optimal as possible.
The old saying, you only get one chance to make a first impression. This is what this show is all about.
Exactly. So with that, let's jump into the slides.
And I'm particularly proud of this little title card we have here for onboarding. Onboarding, get it?
Yeah, like a snowboard, boarding, you're on a board, yeah.
Thanks very much.
So let's get in here. So the first thing we wanted to talk about was that last week, or I guess 2 weeks ago, we did an episode on our top 10, anti-patterns or common UX issues that we saw during review. And number 2, basically, one removed from the last one, was a poor onboarding user experience, and that included a couple of things, requiring registration up front, using splash screens. We're going to talk about all the details here, but we wanted to spend an entire Android Design in Action episode just talking about this because it's so crucial. Mm-hmm. So the first thing is about splash screens. Adam, you want to talk about splash screens?
Yeah, so as we mentioned the other week, don't show them. Let's remember our sort of content first principles here. A splash screen is really not content. It's just another roadblock, another hurdle in the way to the user getting to your application and the actual content in your application. Now, of course, some people will say, well, I really want to make sure my brand is recognized, that the user knows my brand. Well, in Android, we still think brand is very important, of course, but you can use the action bar icon, and of course theming and sort of selecting that accent color to really show off your brand instead. And as you can see here in the screenshots, Google Play is sort of a pretty good example of using that icon and the sort of accent color to really sort of show off the different silos within the different Google Play Store.
And a bunch of people may think, a lot of people think that splash screens are important for when you have content that you need to load before you show your UI. And I'd say my rebuttal to that is, you don't necessarily need to block the entire UI, right? There's probably something that you can show of value. At least show the top level navigation of your app. Mm-hmm. You can always show, like a loading spinner or a really friendly loading spinner, something that involves your brand even, like it doesn't have to be the built-in loading spinner. You can show that in place where content will show up. Mm-hmm. You don't necessarily need to block everything and have the user sit there patiently waiting, just looking at your pretty logo before actually showing your UI. It's actually a good chance to let them start exploring and learning about the different sections in the app rather than just showing them nothing basically.
Yeah, like even if the content isn't there, maybe they can open the drawer and see what's available there. Maybe they can go to settings and see what settings are available. Mm-hmm. They can do other things potentially in the application.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
And I think the worst offenders on the splash screens are the splash screens which decide to go full screen and completely hide away the status bar. Like that's a double, don't do it.
Or the ones that play sound or music at the front.
Yes, exactly. Actually, one of my favorites is you have the splash screen up and then you press back or you press home or something because you just don't want to use the app anymore. And then, splash screen lasts for 3 seconds, but then you press back and then 3 seconds later, the actual next screen just shows up randomly because the splash screen hasn't recognized that you've backed out of it. So it's just, there are so many things that can go wrong with splash screens and they're just a very poor user experience. Just don't use them at all. All right.
I think we covered that.
Yeah, I think we've beaten that dead horse or whatever. I'm really bad at idioms. All right, anyway, let's move on. So the next thing we wanted to cover is tutorials. So we're going to spend some time talking about a couple of main sections of onboarding, main parts to onboarding. The first will be tutorials, then we'll talk about login flow, and then finally I think we'll talk about on-screen overlays. So for tutorials, one thing before we jump into all the details, we do want to mention that there is pretty good coverage of a lot of these things in the Android design guide. So if you visit this link here, you'll see kind of the specifics on when and when not to show unsolicited help. So tutorials are one of those examples of unsolicited help, basically help that you're kind of pushing to the user without them actively requesting it rather. So we very clearly kind of advise against it. There are interruptions, they're usually not necessary, and so on. And so generally, this is something that's covered in our guidelines. But besides that, we wanted to kind of add additional color, I guess, to some of these guidelines and kind of explain some of the reasoning for that. So one of the first things that you should think about is there's a couple of types of tutorials, right? There's speed bump tutorials, mandatory tutorials that you need to kind of go through before you get into the app, and we'll talk about that in a second. That's the type of thing that you shouldn't do, and the reason that you shouldn't do them is generally that it's a sign that you actually may need to simplify your app. Maybe there's too much going on. Maybe your app is just not simple enough. And so certainly that it's generally like a bad sign if you think you need like a pretty complex onboarding flow. Some ways around using kind of the speed bump tutorial style is using something like what Google Play Movies is doing here, and it's still communicating value. It's still telling or I guess expressing the value proposition of the app, but it's doing so in a very direct and contextual way. So info cards is one of the things that Google Play Movies features. It's one of the features that they have. Basically, when you're watching a movie, if you press pause, you actually see information about the character on screen. But the idea here is that we could have thrown up a tutorial that forces you to go through it, but we didn't here. So the idea here was that once you get to the point at which this starts to become interesting, like the user may start caring about this at this point, we actually show this card, or this tutorial card, I guess, and they can obviously very easily dismiss it, or they can just ignore it. If they just start scrolling down, they'll see their content. So it's very passive. It's not super obtrusive, but it does communicate the value, and it does it in a contextual way. If I was in a different section of the app, perhaps it would show me a different kind of hint that there's a feature there.
I think the key to this kind of good tutorial, if you will, is it's non-blocking. I think anything which is like blocking, like especially modal dialogues, one of my personal pet peeves, anything that's like you saying to the user, hey, I know better than you what you need to be doing now, is kind of aggressive, and it kind of breaks any flow or any task they're trying to accomplish. So I think while this is, it's still unsolicited help, I guess, it doesn't have that blocking feature to it, which makes it so much better.
Yeah. So just to specifically talk about I guess, speed bump style tutorials, these are the kind of tutorials where, you see here as an example, you basically, flip through a couple of pages, and maybe at the end there's like a sign up or something, but it's basically like, this is not the app. This is a separate flow before you get to the actual app. That is mandatory. So this is definitely something that you should.
I wonder how many of these screens people actually even read. How many they just see this and immediately try and home in on how do I get past this and just mash that button.
Yeah, and actually, I will say we should probably admit at this point, one of our reference app, the Google I/O app, has a speed bump. Not a tutorial, but it's a different onboarding flow. That's definitely something that we should try to address for the next release. But here, some of the things that you should think about if you absolutely have to do something like this. If management, sends down the word that you must have this kind of tutorial flow, definitely allow immediately skipping. So don't force the user to go next, and then get started. So give them the user give them the option to skip right away. And also, Nick will talk about this in depth later, but if you're going through like, a couple of screens that tell you about the app, and then at the very end, you kind of have to, you have to kind of like, make decisions like sign up or register or whatever. That's just another, way to stop the funnel of engagement with your app. So definitely try to avoid these kinds of speed bump tutorials. All right, I think we've talked about speed bump tutorials quite a bit, but there's a couple of other tutorial type things you can do to educate users about your app, to communicate the value proposition. The first, and this is very obvious, very simple, but doing so via your Google playlisting. A lot of the things, a lot of the features that are available in the developer console are there so that you can kind of have a conversation with your users at the perfect time, right before they install, right before they start using your app. So things like the product video, that's very important. Google Keep is actually a really good example. When you press play here, this is actually, it has pretty high level of prominence on the page, so draws your attention to this video. You start pressing play, and the video that Google Keep has provided it has a very strong narrative. It actually walks you through one one flow, one user using the app. It actually talks about the features, but you actually see the person interacting with the UI. So it's a nice way to kind of imagine yourself in their shoes. You can kind of fill in the gaps. This is how I would probably use the app. And then obviously screenshots. Screenshots are a really good way to communicate what your app does, especially if your UI design is very good and very clear. You can immediately kind of understand what the app does and how it works just by looking at the screenshot.
One thing I would say on the screenshots as well is be careful of the order you put them in. Quite often I'll see screenshots uploaded for an application, and it seems like they're in the order in which you might go through the application. So in some apps, I've even seen a splash screen uploaded as the first screenshot, and then a login screen, and then maybe further down the line, perhaps once you're into the actual content within the application. And that's a real shame because, well, as you can see here on a screenshot from the web, there's only room for one or two, and this is even more exaggerated when you're on a device. So you'll probably see the video, maybe one screenshot, perhaps half of the second one coming in here. So you really want to be showing your hero moments, the thing that really clearly expresses what this application is all about first, and then forget about these other ancillary screens.
For sure.
And of course, showing screenshots for different form factors.
Yes.
Don't forget to do that as well.
Yeah, because if I'm on a device, if I'm on a 10-inch tablet, I want to see what it's going to look like on my device. If I'm on a 4-inch phone, I want to see exactly what it's going to look like on a phone. So, all right, moving on. Another way to communicate, again, your value proposition or educate your users, give them a tutorial about your content, is through the empty state. And this is actually one of my favorites, not because this is specifically my app, but this is one of my favorite opportunity moments, is in the empty states. So, most apps these days have collections of things. They have screens where there's collections of things, collections of movies, collections of, in this case, extensions for a clock. There's lots of different lists. Too often we see developers missing the opportunity of that empty state. When there's nothing in that list, use that as the opportunity to talk to your user. Tell them how to add things to that list, why they should add things to that list. Actually put buttons in there, in that empty state, that let them take action, fix the problem of the empty state. Generally, people don't want an empty state. They want it to be populated, right? So one of the ways in which you could do that is you could just simply use that empty state for all sorts of things. In this example, this is the Dash Clock app that I wrote. You actually, before you add any extensions, you get greeted with this screen here, and then you can press this button to add an extension. As soon as you add something, you kind of start seeing the full populated list. And it's very easy to do from a development standpoint. You basically just provide an empty view for the list.
Yeah, quite commonly you might imagine, well, quite often I see screens which might be like this on the left, but it's just empty screen with maybe a small plus in the action bar, and that's such a missed opportunity.
Right. Yeah. One thing I will say here is that there's just a bit too much text here. Probably just be very visual, be very kind of, not really immersive, but just be very visual on this screen if possible. Here I kind of didn't do that. But anyway. So let's move on to the next screen. Another important way to communicate, your value proposition, to explain to users how to, use your app, is to pre-populate it with how you like to say bootstrapped content, right? So, this is an example from Michael Pardo, as an app called Quotes, and gives you your stock quotes, obviously. And so one way he could have designed this app is that when you first install it and you open it up, it just has no quotes in there, right? It is just a blank, set of, it's a blank list, and it doesn't show you any interesting data. Maybe it just shows you like the S&P index or whatever. But what he decided to do here is that he decided to actually pre-populate your portfolio with a couple of common stocks. Here they have a cake, but I'm not sure if that's like Cheesecake Factory, pizza, which is probably one of the delivery services. And so you kind of immediately see the value of the app. You immediately see the data you're going to be working with. Obviously you can very quickly remove them. You just long press, select them all and just remove, or you can just add to it. But it's actually just a very nice, simple way to just immediately get started. So I think that was it for tutorials. Any parting words on tutorials before we move on, guys?
No, I think that's covered.
Yeah.
Alrighty, let's do it. Nick, take it away for login registration.
Yeah, so this is one of my pet peeves, is the login experience and registration. So the first thing I'd say for a login is that you should really be delaying it until it's kind of absolutely necessary. Just like those kind of speed bump tutorials that we looked at earlier, it's another thing to do when you're already kind of quite cognitively loaded. Like the first time you run an application, there's a lot going on, right? You're kind of getting used to it, like, you know, the way it looks and feels, the way the navigation is laid out. You're understanding like what the app is doing, and if you're like throwing on all these extra layers of stuff, then it's just a lot for the user to process. So by far and away, I'd say delay it until the last moment possible. And the second point I want to make here is people are probably more likely to actually complete the logon if they can clearly understand why it's necessary. So an example of this, a great example of this is, I was shown here, is the Tumblr application. So when you install Tumblr, you get the opportunity to log on, but you don't have to. You can immediately start using the application. You can explore different Tumblr blogs, and you can actually take kind of logged in type actions. So for example here, I haven't actually logged into the application, but I've already been able to go through and start following people. And if I were to then decide to log in or sign up, it would then take all those actions which I've already done and just merge them into the account I've just created. So it's a truly wonderful example. And in this example here as well, so if once I followed a blog, if I try to do any actions that obviously requires login, so if I tried to like it or comment on something, at that point, it then says, hey, you need to be logged in to do this. And I can clearly understand why. Like, it's demonstrated its value to me already, and I'm much more likely, I think, to complete it.
It's kind of like an inherent, it's a very contextual, almost like direct manipulation, in the sense that, like, it's very clear that when I'm pressing this and I see a sign-in dialog, there's, the reason to sign in is because this won't work without that.
Right.
Whereas if you were to ask somebody to sign in the very beginning, and that as part of that tutorial flow, there's no expression of value, right? It's not clear. It's very indirect, right? If it's even there at all. So.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, and the next step is when you do to provide logon. Like, logging on can be a kind of painful experience. It often involves data entry, which isn't always the easiest, and it's often a pain for you as well, having to kind of like manage and secure passwords and so on and so forth. So an alternative might be is to consider using some of the kind of common logon providers. So people are likely to have a bunch of accounts on their device already. So you might have a Google account, a Facebook account, Twitter account, some of these common providers, and they offer much faster and easier login services. So we're particularly a fan of the Google Plus logon because most Android users, every Android user has a Gmail account to sign into the Play Store. So there's a good chance they'll be able to log in with that.
And another thing is, even with Facebook, right? I mean, a lot of users have Facebook installed. When you use their SDK, rather than kind of using a separate, web-based flow, when you use the SDK, you actually benefit from the user's account already on the device. So you don't even have to actually type in your Facebook username and password or Facebook email and password. You basically touch it. It knows that you're already logged in. It asks you to confirm and so on. And obviously with Google Plus, it's the same way. It's actually I think
pretty seamless.
Yeah, it's very, very seamless. Very much worth it.
Definitely. One point we wanted to make on that is to include an email alternative. Some people just aren't that comfortable, and they perhaps might be worried, is this going to publish stuff to my timeline and so forth? And some people just are adverse to it. So while we definitely recommend this as a great way to go, then we would definitely say include an alternative.
Yep.
All right. And as an aside, while we're talking about login, one of my favorite things is when you actually remove the need to log in altogether, and that's offered quite neatly, I think, by the Google Plus sign-in. So if you choose to go down that route, and you already have a popular web property, if the user signs in on the web property using the same Google Plus account, it'll actually pop up and offer them, hey, would you like to install the Android app at the same time? So it's a great discovery mechanism. But the greatest thing is that the user, it will be automatically logged in already in the Android app. So you skip the need for this altogether. Fantastic.
Yeah, it's one of the best ways to remove friction, right? I mean, that's what that's what probably the business folks are always thinking about is, how do we? It's always about the funnel, right? How do we maximize the funnel?
Exactly.
How do we, minimize the roadblocks in the funnel? And this is one of the best ways to do that.
Cool. So that's particularly fun. On from login, we're talking about the registration steps. So I want to say here that I do offer to sign up on device. I find it quite frustrating when an application hasn't implemented like a registration step. So it kind of boots me out to a web view or something like that, which might have worse kind of data entry and form filling kind of capabilities. So I definitely urge you to kind of include it within your application, but try to make it as painless as possible. So as we were saying, data entry on mobile devices isn't always the most fun experience. So especially at this critical time when you're trying to get someone to sign up for your service, think of that funnel. So you want to keep it as painless as possible. So here's a kind of concocted example, which is kind of trying to prove the point, like
social security number.
Yeah, make it as simple as possible. Don't ask someone to enter an email address on the phone and then confirm it. I mean, that's pretty painful, right? And some other steps. So I'm going to walk you through some improvements to this screen here. So the first thing I'd say is to remove repetitive or non-essential fields here. So already this screen is starting to look a little bit better if we got rid of having to repeat both your email and your password and some extra information which might not be completely essential to the sign up, and you can maybe prompt for it later on when they understand the value proposition of that or on a different kind of medium. So already this is starting to look a little bit better. The next step, one of my personal favorites here, is to suggest an email if the user starts filling it in. So your Android device knows a lot about you. It already knows the email addresses, maybe some usernames that you've entered. So once the user starts typing, or you could offer this as a pick from list if you want, then do suggest. One thing to be wary of, I've seen some implementations of this where they just see if there's already an email address on the device and then it just pre-fill it, but they don't let you pick, so which kind of isn't great for users who have more than one account on the device. So definitely let them switch between multiple accounts if they have that. But yeah, already this has got so much easier. Just with a couple of key taps, I can just pick from this list here.
And one of the things one of the questions that actually we discussed earlier was how do you actually show this list, right? Do you show an additional affordance to pick? Mm-hmm. And certainly if you use the Google Play Services SDK, there's actually something called Account Picker. That's a dialog that pops up, and that actually doesn't require any permissions. Mm-hmm. And so if you wanted to show the Account Picker dialog, you could have an additional button next to this field rather than a drop-down. Mm-hmm. But if you do decide to go for a drop-down, which is also very nice, the way I'd probably do this is, as soon as the text field is focused, drop down the list, and then, as it loses focus, collapse that list. As an alternative, you could have an additional kind of spinner type affordance on the side that pops up the list, but generally, it's probably best to just show the list immediately. And I think that may be how the autocomplete stuff works by default, but not quite sure. But.
Great. Cool. Another side note we've added here is to prefer email to usernames. I don't know about you, but I just find when I'm forced to pick a username rather than just using my email address, it's just another thing I'm not going to remember. Right. Whereas it all comes back to the email at the end of the day anyway, so you can reset it and so forth. So
and the worst is when there's a service where the username is your email and it says username. Just say email. Just ask for the person's email.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it works really, really well on Android because you are able to query the device for known ones as well. So there we go. So next up, passwords. So we said here, make it optional. So you could either, just not require users to enter a password. You could do something like auto-generating one, pre-fill it in and let them cycle it or something like that. You could just say it's optional. Some users will want to set it, some users might not. But my preferred option would be just to probably omit it altogether. I mean, I'm probably going to enter something very weak or very quick anyway. I'd rather just, it's in the background generated to something super secure or something like that, and then I can always just hit the, forgot password or reset button should I really, want to get access to that password or, I've forgotten it somehow. So.
And maybe later when you're on your desktop, when you have a real keyboard, you can get that email and actually fill out a real password or something like that.
Yeah, you get the email, click here to actually set a password or something.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking back to that kind of funnel analogy of how many people are going to get through this step, if you think back to that first screen with all those fields and so on, rather than just one, which is going to help me fill in the only field anyway by suggesting something and a button to hit sign up, you've got to imagine that the funnel is a lot better for this.
One thing I wanted to add is, I guess, with passwords, one of my biggest pet peeves is when there's passwords that require symbols and capital letters and all this stuff. And generally, people, it's a bad practice, but a lot of people use the same type of password or the same, it might even be a strong password. It might be very long, but people people like to use similar passwords, and when you ask them to start introducing like symbols and all these arbitrary constraints, it actually makes them forget their password. I mean, I don't know how many times, I don't know if it's a bank password, but like some of my bank passwords, like, I mean, I've probably had to reset them a bunch of times, or like my account for like cable or something like that. Generally, try to enforce it maybe on minimum size, but not so much on symbols. And there's actually a really funny XKCD about like arbitrary password restrictions. Basically, like, I think the result was that if you have a very long string of just regular words, like hello there, my name is John or something, and if they're completely random words with no symbols, no anything, the entropy of that is actually a lot higher than a very short password, let's say 8 characters long, with a whole bunch of symbols and stuff. So, think about that before you require people to use or to provide symbols.
I think generally just don't get into the game of holding passwords if you can. I think these social providers, Facebook, Google, Twitter spend a lot of kind of time and money and thought and engineering into keeping things like this secure. And if you have the option of not doing that, that's pretty attractive, I think. You don't want to be the one who loses someone's a database of passwords or something.
Right, exactly.
Oh, and one other note, tiny one here, but is that you can also help the user out by replacing where the enter key would normally be on the keyboard with some kind of text saying, which is contextual to what you're doing. So, that you're quite kind of programmed to type and then hit next or whatever that button is, and if that actually does something and when the user hits that, it's the same as hitting the on-screen sign up button. It's just another tiny thing that will help the user to kind of complete this flow easier.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess similar to that as well, in case there's other fields that you need to collect, like maybe a phone number, you can set the data type on that field appropriately so the keyboard adjusts itself to sort of optimize for that field.
And you actually notice that here, this is an email type field, so you automatically get the @ sign and the dot sign. So.
And there's other fields. We talked about email quite a lot that you can query the device for. But there's other fields you can query for from, I think, Ice Cream Sandwich and beyond. The device has a concept of the user's profile. So with a permission, you can ask for their first name, last name.
Even their avatar photo.
Yeah, the avatar photo. You can also get telephone number if you're on a phone type device. So each of these will cost you a permission, but it depends if it's critical to your sign up flow.
How important it is, yeah.
Then that might ease it and increase signups.
Yeah. All right, shall we move on to on-screen overlays? Adam?
Yeah, sure, let's do it. So this is pretty quick, but on-screen overlays, so the general rule of thumb here is avoid them. In particular,
I think I've seen enough of those kind of like hand-drawn style arrows coming out.
Yeah, exactly. In particular, you should avoid them for common UI patterns. So we're talking action bar. You really don't need to tell the user how to use these things again. The other thing we mentioned here was the navigation drawer, and I don't think we mentioned this yet, but there's actually a recommended pattern for the navigation drawer that when the user first loads the app, you can actually open that navigation drawer for them, just so for discoverability, almost like a tutorial in itself.
Animate to open as well, because that teaches the gesture.
Exactly, and then the first time they actually go and use the drawer, they close it or open it themselves. You can set a flag there, and then you don't need to open it again on future times they open the application. So you really don't need an on-screen overlay to sort of help the user discover that drawer. You can use another method like that.
Yeah, generally, users are learning things like the drawer, like the action bar overflow. They're learning things by using things like apps like Gmail, like Google Keep, like Google Drive. A lot of these apps come pre-installed on their devices before they ever install your app. So they're learning these patterns. There's no need to really kind of educate them further about patterns they probably already know.
When it comes to help, the perfect place for that is the overflow menu. And I think earlier on Roman had a link to the design guidelines, which sort of goes into a bit more detail on how help should be structured within your application.
Yeah, it's basically like the difference between unsolicited help and solicited help. It's kind of like push
users
versus
like
pull.
Crying out for help. They're going to go to the overflow and find what they need there. Now there is some times where it's appropriate to have on-screen overlays though. So custom gestures, like sort of very specific gestures to your application that are just very custom and interesting and different to other applications, it can be appropriate. And a really good example of that here that we have in the screenshot is the YouTube application. And so one of the more recent updates to the YouTube application actually allows you to basically continue to browse YouTube while minimizing the current video that's playing. And so in the bottom right there, that video would be playing right now. And the first time that you see this in the new YouTube application, it gives you this little overlay so that you can sort of understand the gestures that you can apply to that particular video. So swiping there to the left dismisses the video, and swiping up actually maximizes the video back into sort of the full screen view.
Yeah.
So I think this is a really good use of an overlay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's all we have this week on the onboarding experience. So thanks very much for joining us. And as always, I'm your host, Nick Butcher.
Roman Nurk.
Adam Kosh. See you guys.